to further prosecute this issue. Still keeping it with matters with the economy, Kenya is well within the borrowing limits and the country's economy remains stable despite the headwinds it continues to face. Treasury CS Henry Rotich told journalists that the macroeconomic fundamentals remained stable and there was no cause for alarm of the debt the country has taken so far. He went on to add that Kenya will be looking to the international markets to tap into additional foreign funding as and when Treasury foresees a need.
So the point is, I think what you were struggling to write was that is it that we are going to go issue another euro bond to pay, but as I said, we'll access the international capital market, but we have already resolved the issue. So there was no link first from what you are trying to report. I read some politics in it a bit, in a way, when you start writing and bringing in all the previous Eurobond and the issues that it has not been accounted and all that. I think we were in that debate. That Auditor General had to give his report on it.
Well, like I mentioned, we want to cross over to our city center studios where we have on standby Dominic Omondi, who is a writer with the Standard newspaper and also does a lot of economic reporting. And many thanks, Dominic, for joining us this afternoon. And well, looking at the state of affairs, the Treasury is saying that economic growth has been revised to 5.1%. What does this really mean to the average Kenyan?
Abby, thank you for having me. What it simply means is that, of course, you should have started by saying that they've revised downwards. They had projected a much higher growth of around 5.8, 5.9, but they've revised downwards to 5.1. That is because the economy is basically facing some headwinds. You saw the situation with drought, which affected agriculture, of course. We have a situation where several sectors of the economy, households and farms can't access credit. Credit extension has been low. You also have the extended electioneering period, which has basically depressed investment, where investors are taking a wait and see kind of approach. And that has, in some, had the effect of, will have the effect of bringing down the country's GDP. And as Treasury has put it, that is down from a projection of 5.9 to 5.1, which is in line with, of course, IMF's projection, which also puts it at around 5. So it means there's been less output of goods and services. There will be less output of goods and services in this period. And also, it also means there'll be the consumption, demand will also have gone down, yes.
And Dominic, it's quite interesting because all this is coming at a time when the economy had already begun softening even before the elections. We did see the agricultural sector taking a beating, really, in the last few months in the lead up to the elections. And the Treasury still maintains that from 2018, growth will be bouncing back, and they're quite optimistic. Should we also be optimistic, really?
Well, that is something that people have to take on an individual basis, whether you choose to be optimistic or to be pessimistic. Economists would approach it in a pragmatic way instead of just saying that I'm being optimistic or being pessimistic, by basically looking at the fundamentals. And the fundamentals here is basically just looking at the macroeconomic environment. And if everything is okay, if you have a situation where farms can access credit, if agriculture, which happens to constitute a huge chunk of our country's economy, rebounds. And you can see because we've had some rains, but not sufficient rains. If you have a situation where people are willing to invest in the country, then of course we will see a rebound. A rebound of the economy come 2018. But that also is dependent on several things. Some of them might be really pegged on the political environment. But in my opinion, most of it is basically pegged on the fundamentals. The economy, when you look at issues like, in agriculture, of course, you had drought, which affected the harvest of several food crops and even cash crops. Crops like coffee, tea, and horticultural products. Those ones were affected, and you can see it even in the figures that are coming from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. They've gone down. Exports, the value of exports from those produce has gone down. Even before we got into the heated political environment, you could see credit extension to farms and households going down. Those are things that should be really divorced from the so-called political environment. I think that the political environment only served to aggravate what had already started to become a bad macroeconomic environment.
Let's shift the gears a bit and let's talk about debt sustainability for Kenya. Right now, we're looking at a debt to GDP ratio of 49%, and this is the net nominal figure that the IMF also works with. And ideally, other economies like Ghana, which have a debt to GDP ratio of about 74%, have ended up in a situation where the economy has been sort of in a turmoil of sorts, and this has also affected their debt obligations. Should we be worried as a country on our debt levels at the moment? And of course, a lot of debt has been gobbled up in infrastructure spending, which is yet to trickle down in terms of the return on investment for the country.
See, Abby, I didn't attend the function that the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury had, but I'm told that in that function he said something to the effect that the local media seems to be reporting about debt as if it's a crime. Countries, households, companies, they borrow and use the money to certain ends, and so it's not a crime to borrow. What might be a crime, of course, a crime in quote unquote, is borrowing so that you can, and borrowing and not being able to repay. That should worry us if at all we cannot mobilize enough revenue and be able to repay the debts that we have accumulated by our own revenues. And instead, what we are hearing from the reports that are coming in is that the government is preparing for another sovereign bond. To repay another syndicated loan simply means we haven't been able to pay another loan, so we are taking another debt so that we can repay another debt. In my opinion, that looks worrying. I also don't know about the debt to GDP ratio, because the last time I looked at IMF figures, they put it at 53%. You're talking about 49%. One of the documents by Treasury itself talks of 53.4%. And we are not very sure what level. Even the IMF itself is not very sure what percentage should be read as worrying or as being unsustainable. But they have a cryptic way of telling whether the debt to GDP ratio is unsustainable, and it can be even less than 50 depending on the economy, or in some countries it can be, more than 50.
Interesting. And of course, Dominic, the debt situation can not be fully exhausted in this particular conversation, but let's move things forward a bit. And looking at revenue collections, we did hear today, I was actually in that particular event where the Treasury CS was saying that the tax authority might miss revenue collection targets, and he did give a figure of about 40 billion shillings. And what's the net effect right now, looking at the bigger picture where KRA has been struggling to raise revenue domestically? Will this perhaps see Kenya transition into tougher austerity measures in order to ensure that we sort of don't lose sight of the prudent fiscal management?
Of course, that is it is in the public domain that the Kenya Revenue Authority is going to miss the revenue collection target by about 40 billion shillings. What that means is that, of course, if you cannot finance your budget using your own revenues, then you have to get the money from somewhere else. Or you have to suspend certain expenditures, so of course meaning now fiscal consolidation. I know institutions such as IMF have been calling for fiscal consolidation, so it means rationalization, where you have even some of the staff being sent home, certain agencies being merged, suspending certain expenditures that really are not very essential, which is again very debatable as to what is essential and what is not essential. But ultimately, I think what the government is going to do is to go for another round of borrowing. It can be borrowing locally or borrowing from outside. And of course, borrowing locally, again, I don't know with the capping of interest rate whether it will have the effect of crowding out the private sector, but most likely they are going to go for outside borrowing, external.
All right. Dominic Omondi, pleasure speaking to you. We'll pause the conversation there for a while as we get some other updates on the business world that we have lined up for you.